Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Here's what's coming up.
They have a system where they only count any death which has respiratory failure as the cause of death on the death certificate. This is in stark contrast to an opposition for the United States, which, for instance, is any situation where the SARS infection was likely to lead to death.
We discuss whether China might be covering up the extent of its COVID crisis. Then, Russia and China's strategic partnership continues as the Ukraine war reaches its 10th month. We ask how far the two countries' militaries seen practicing here could work together in a potential Taiwan conflict. Plus,
50 years on, we again find ourselves facing great challenges, including contest, climate and, of course, COVID-19. We believe dialogue better enables us to manage these challenges.
Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong goes to Beijing to push for a lifting of trade sanctions and consular access to two detained Australians on the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Australia and China. Also,
you also have to remember the People's Liberation Army currently does not have any veterans in it. And because of that, there's also a desire in many People's Liberation Army related writings to want to figure out how can we gain more experience.
Bryce Barros on how former combat pilots are being lured into teaching China's military the secrets of how to operate US advanced weapons. Welcome to the show. I'm Yin Khvat. Our guests today are Lai I-chung, Prospect Foundation President. He's also a former Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in Japan Special Assistant and former Taiwan Thinktank Vice President and former Cornell University Visiting Researcher. Tso Chen-dong, National Taiwan University Political Science Professor and formerly the Kuomintang's Mainland Affairs Department Director. And earlier I spoke to Bryce Barros, German Marshall Fund in the US, Alliance for Securing Democracy, China Affairs Analyst and former Caron Analyst. President, Professor, a very warm welcome to the show today. We begin the show with China's hospitals, morgues and funeral parlors overwhelmed as COVID-19 surges through the country. They tell a different story to the deaths reported by Beijing. This report by Ryan Ho-Kilpatrick.
Overwhelmed hospitals, empty pharmacies, morgues and crematoria stretched beyond capacity. These scenes of the COVID-19 outbreaks tearing across China paint a desperate picture. A doctor at a Shanghai hospital says staff are struggling to keep up amid surging demand and unpredictable policy shifts. To protect her identity, she asked not to appear on camera and to have her voice distorted.
病人越来越多，就是一天比一天多的感觉。因为现在医院也没有一个很完美的方案去概括所有的问题，就是每天的政策都在改变。
All this defies the official figures. Since abruptly ending years of harsh zero-COVID measures earlier this month, the government has reported daily deaths in the single digits. A virologist at a Hong Kong university says they're manipulating how cases are counted in order to minimize the crisis. She asked that we also take steps to protect her identity.
They have a system where they only count any death which has respiratory failure as the cause of death on the death certificate. This is in stark contrast to an opposition for the United States, which, for instance, is any situation where the SARS infection was likely to lead to death. I would calculate that the United States would have about 75,000 COVID-19 deaths using China's criteria. The actual number is 1 million there.
The government's sudden about-face on COVID came after nationwide anti-lockdown protests. But the extent of the current outbreaks, this expert says, shows COVID-0 had already failed at this point.
It is very clear that the outbreaks had already been going just from the numbers, and as for how plausible it is, not at all. We're still in the relative early days. There's always a time lag between cases and deaths. But if you just look at just any of the articles, you have crematoria working 24/7, backed up with days. The bodies in the refrigerator trucks in the middle of the street, stuff like that. It is completely implausible, and just based off of everything that we know, primarily from Hong Kong, it's going to get worse. By the time this peters out, we're expect something on the order of 1 to 3 million.
Earlier this year, once COVID-free Hong Kong saw its death rate top the world when the virus finally slipped through the cracks, decimating the under-vaccinated elderly population. Experts see the same tragedy now replaying in the mainland.
Then China resist having mRNA, and China did not spend a lot of effort on vaccination of older people. Instead, they spend too much effort on PCR. So a lot of observers already point out the cost of PCR almost equal to the cost of vaccination. Why not vaccine older people first? But you can see that China did not do that.
These images emerging from China almost all come from the country's biggest and most developed cities. The situation in smaller cities and the countryside may be far worse.
China's healthcare system is very unequal. If you go to Beijing, they have so many good hospitals. Then if you go to Shanghai, also not so bad. But if you go to third-tier cities or like rural areas, it's different situation. Rural areas, if you call ambulance, they will not come to you within 1 hour. Even sometimes they will come to you within 2 or 3 hours. It's impossible to handle some emergent cases.
As the wider world moves on, China's opening up bookends the long and tragic story of this pandemic. And it is ending much as it began in Wuhan 3 years ago, with the rest of the world anxiously looking to China and wondering what is really happening on the ground. Ryan Hill-Kilpatrick for Taiwan Plus.
That report by Ryan Hill-Kilpatrick. UK-based health data firm Airfinity has predicted that China is actually seeing 5,000 deaths and 1 million cases every day. And yet China's National Health Commission hasn't reported any deaths since the country relaxed its COVID restrictions and only 3,000 cases daily. Zhejiang province alone has estimated it is seeing around 1 million cases every day and expects that figure to double by the year's end. President Lai, if I can come to you first, can China's official data be trusted?
I don't think that the Chinese themselves trusted their own government's data. So I think right now, basically the Chinese data, you have a very low credibility, first among the Chinese people, but also among the world health experts. And also it seems to indicate that even the Chinese government knows what is going on, so that they decided not to release any data anymore. That
Mike
makes
Ryan of the WHO actually said that maybe they're playing catch up, maybe they're completely overwhelmed. What do you think about that explanation?
Because right now a lot of people there suspecting whether those that bigger scale of the contamination due to the pandemic, that caused from the yield to the demand of the white paper revolutions. But then, as Mike Ryan also indicated, that the cases probably they were already there before the people are demanding the opening up, and the probably, of course, those are all speculation. Probably the Chinese government they thought that the white paper revolution probably would be a very good excuse for them to escape from the being held accountable for the earlier underreporting the cases, especially due to the not so effective zero COVID policies, so that they can get away from the being blamed for the executing a very ineffective zero COVID policy at the same time, and also blame the white paper revolutions. Politically, that's convenient, but in terms of the public health care, that's a disaster.
Because Xi Jinping previously had stressed life, preserving life, and now they seem to be doing this in an effort to simply shift the blame for, as you said, a failed strategy of Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it seems to me it's like that. Yeah, so that it is important to right now to really go to the extent about what the Chinese government is planning to do next. One other thing is that they apparently try to shift the blame to the white paper revolution. And what would this cause for other kind of the social movement that probably in the offspring, would they be deterred from expressing themselves due to the fear of to be put on blame by other issues.
I see, yeah. So it's a deterrent for any other protests, public protests across China. Professor Tso, China also recently changed the way that it reports COVID deaths, reporting only those caused by pneumonia and respiratory failure after contracting COVID. What do you think is the reason for this change?
In fact, I'm not quite sure if this is still relevant because China's National Health Commission just announced yesterday that it will stop publishing daily COVID data, and then the release of relevant data will be done by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and that will be only for the purpose of research. So it
won't be publicly available?
Yeah, yes, from the central government. So I think this way of reporting, I'm not sure if it is still applicable to Chinese official information. But I think in the meantime, we also see that several local governments have provided information on updated COVID situation.
Such as Zhejiang?
Zhejiang province, and also like Qingdao municipal government and the Dongguan municipal government.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about this. So what's the implications of stopping to report COVID deaths? I mean, obviously, Zhejiang has taken it upon themselves to actually try to provide estimates because they obviously believe it's worthwhile. So what are the implications of underreporting or not reporting COVID deaths?
So as I mentioned, you have to divide it into the central level and the local level. At the central level, it will not report daily information on COVID status. But on the provincial level, we see Zhejiang province provincial government has just done that, and we also see several municipal governments have done that too. So I think
so it's a shift from the centralized national figures to now all separate individual province numbers.
That's right. That's right. So I think the implication first is that the provincial government or the municipal government will take the main responsibility of providing needed information to the public. So that's become the new way of getting the public informed about the situation in their in the provinces or municipal areas where they live. On the other hand, we also see that this new release seems to be more in line with what people feel on the ground. So the number of cases is much larger than previous official numbers. So I think the second implication for that is that China is catching up, as you just mentioned, whether it's overwhelmed or whether it's catching up. I think previously the data is collected by mass testing, where the mass testing is conducted in places where there are cases reported or where people are asking to get into public arenas. But now this requirement is considered as part of the zero COVID policy is removed. So the government in the beginning of the removal of the old policy seemed to have no data to collect. So that's why I think the government is catching up with the new situation. And that can also explain why the central government in mainland China revised their policies of releasing data several times, because it has to find new ways to collect data.
So you think that this is quite reasonable, a release, a recording of the COVID situation in China?
I think it is not fully satisfactory, but I think the situation seems to propel the government to take some time to catch up with the new situation on the ground. So, but of course, if the government can really catch up with the situation and can find new ways to get the full grasp of the situation, I think it will be very important for them to get public informed of the whole situation.
President Lai, China might then possibly be the first country that doesn't provide an aggregate totals for its country. It provides by province. Can we talk about another area that one of the experts there in the report spoke about in terms of China specifically? He said that China spent too many resources on testing and not enough on boosting its medical and health systems. Do you think China spent its time wisely during the containment period?
About this, I think the Chinese government in the past, they actually are among the first country to develop their own vaccines, and even export some of the vaccines overseas and to help some countries in need. So when we talk about the Chinese vaccinations, I think it is important to know that China is not a latecomer. They are early in front. But so the issue is actually about the effectiveness of their own vaccine and how much of the Chinese people trust about the effectiveness of the vaccines. And it seems that despite the very strong advocacy and the strong push promotion for the vaccinations, the older generation apparently they have great hesitancy regarding having a vaccine injected in their own body. Whether that's because of the traditional belief that the people, especially Chinese medicine, you seldom do something injected in your body. You take medicines, but you never try to cut yourself open. Or it is actually they have some credibility issue regarding the vaccines. But the vaccination rate for the elder generation apparently is low. But even for the younger generations, if the vaccine is so effective, at least we should not be able to see that many of the numbers to be contacted and also have a serious syndromes. So that I think it boils down to the issues about the effectiveness of the vaccines. And it seems that some of the experts within China, they knows about this issue. But Xi Jinping, his own nationalistic impulse, sort of they try to prevent overseas or the foreign vaccines come to China to inject in Chinese people's body, and they believe that only the Chinese vaccine that can be used for the Chinese people themselves. So you can say that it's a combination of whether the effectiveness of the earlier Chinese-made vaccine and also the kind of nationalistic impulse by the central leadership regarding whether the Chinese people can take the vaccine developed by other countries.
Thank you. Still to come in the show, on the 50th anniversary of ties between Australia and China, Beijing stresses common interests, while Canberra distinguishes its national interests and values.
We've continued to put the view that we are able to grow our bilateral relationship and uphold our respective national interests if we navigate our differences wisely. I did set out our positions on issues which I know are so important to Australians and are important to the government. Relevant consular matters, trade blockages, human rights, as well as regional security, international security, and the norms and global rules which underpin our prosperity.
But first, as Russia and China kicked off joint naval exercises, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev held surprise talks with Xi Jinping in Beijing. Medvedev said the two men discussed their country's no-limits strategic partnership, including industrial production and the economy. Back in Russia, Vladimir Putin oversaw the launch of a major new Siberian gas field as part of Moscow's strategy to shift gas exports from the EU to China. The Power of Siberia pipeline supplied Beijing with 10 billion cubic meters of gas in 2021 and is due to reach 38 billion cubic meters in 2025. With construction of another pipeline, Moscow is aiming to take that amount up to 88 billion cubic meters by 2030, more than half of what it exported to the EU in 2021. Meanwhile, on the Ukraine crisis, Xi Jinping told Medvedev he actively promotes peace talks and hopes that, quote, relevant parties will exercise rational restraint, carry out comprehensive dialogues, and resolve common security concerns through political means. President Lai, again, if I could come to you first, what is the message that Xi Jinping is sending on Ukraine? Is this a strong message?
It is not a strong message at all, because I think China, even today, despite the apparent invasion, the effect of the invasions by Russia on Ukraine, and China still refused to condemn Russia about its own actions. And I have to say that this became very apparent when Xi Jinping became the president of China. Although in year 2014, at the early days of Xi Jinping being the president of China, and the Chinese wasn't that happy with Russia's annexation of the Crimea, because that violates some of the Chinese so-called no interference of the state sovereignties principles. But as Xi Jinping got hold of the power more and more, the relations between China and Russia become closer. And it also indicates that right now China-Russia relation become very personal relation between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And so this is basically a personal affinity dominates national strategic thinkings. And that the Western expect China to do something, but China still refuses to do even the minimum. If you compare with India and Russia and China, the India, of course, did not condemn or support any sanctions against Russia, but India came out very public in support of the Ukraine, in support of how the humanitarian assistance should be able to be there, and how even India came out to provide the venue for the peace talk between Russia and Ukraine. And China done none of those. So I will say that even today, although Xi Jinping right now seems to play the even hand, he calls for the peace talk between all parties, but never said that which one is the invaders. And also he talks about how the peace should be achieved. But if the peace needs to be achieved, how about Russia's occupation of those territories? And would those be the case, or will be the price for the Ukraine to accept? So those are the things that are important. It's not just the empty the call for the peace, the slogan such as that. So I would say that even today, in Xi Jinping's mind, I'm not going to say that probably that this position is shared by all the Chinese Foreign Ministry bureaucrats, but Xi Jinping's mind that the China-Russia strategic alliance is still the most paramount things that when he deals with the Russian invasion on Ukraine.
Professor Tso, empty words there from Xi Jinping, according to President Lai. Do you agree with that?
I think it takes some time to get a real and objective evaluation. Up to this point, China has not condemned Russia on its invasion into Ukraine. That's true. But in the meantime, China has not provided Russia with any weapons for its war in Ukraine.
Let's talk about the other support it has given Russia, though. We saw there the pipeline. So it is, the EU wants to stop paying for energy, Russian energy, because it wants to stop funding the war. China is in effect stepping in and funding that war, which is a huge support to Russia.
I'm not quite sure if that could be considered as a support, because not only China but also India that buy up enormous volume of Russian oil. I think the two countries really need those oil, and they need this material for their energy usage. And what I'm just trying to say is that as I said, first of all, China has not provided any weapons to Russia, even though we see Russia using weapons from North Korea and also from Iran, but not from China. And secondly, I think China does feel some pressure from European countries, I think, and increasingly from United States to play a role in pushing Russia into taking some concrete steps to end the war. And so there is a reporter from Guardian, the newspaper from Great Britain, reporting that President Xi Jinping does send a letter to President Putin requesting an explanation on how President Putin will end the war. So, and that becomes the whole issue, or the core issue, in Xi Jinping's meeting with Medvedev just several days ago. And I think that is also the reason why Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken made a call to Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, in discussing the Ukraine situation. Yeah.
So you believe that Xi Jinping is actually trying to use his influence against Putin. President Lai, what's your view on that?
No, I do not think that Xi Jinping is actually using his influence to trying to stop the war or to end the war. He just asked the Putin about what is your plan and about how war will end. And Putin always, his plan is that I will just invade and conquer the Ukraine, and when Ukraine surrender, all war will end. So what do you mean by that? If that is the way of the Xi Jinping helping to end the wars, I don't see that. Of course, you could say that the Chinese foreign ministry, they're speaking tongues that's a little bit different. But just I said that the China-Russia relation right now very much become a Xi Jinping and Putin the personal relationship, and that issue started to dominate almost every corners. And I have to say that despite there's no apparent outright evidence as China is supporting the arms to the Russia, but we do find a lot of evidence about China is actually supporting Russia's disinformation campaign through the Chinese official website and through the foreign ministry about those information campaign, whether that the U.S. is building the bio weapon laboratory in the Ukraine or others. So those are the things that is equally important in terms of how you are aiding the war.
I think what I would like to supplement is that many people hope or wish China could do more. And just before recently, China seems quite reserved with regard to taking concrete steps in intervening in the situation. But right now, as I said, according to the recent meeting that she had with Medvedev, and also according to the report from the British newspaper, I think China is trying to do something. I'm not saying that China is taking huge steps in doing that, but I'm saying that China has, it seems that China is doing something. And I think it would be better if China can really do more.
But Xi Jinping could pick up the phone to speak to Putin. No.
But
that's just the last question. Sorry.
I think it is not the case for the diplomatic for the diplomatic behavior. Let's just make it clear. Usually, it takes some steps ahead of that phone call. You need to have like discussion between the foreign ministers. You need to have a discussion between ambassadors. Then, when everything is laid out and get a certain consensus, then the two leaders can talk. So I think that's the way we see President Biden and President Xi Jinping talk over the phone or meet in person. And I believe that is also the way Xi Jinping and Putin meet.
Okay. President Lai, final question. The joint military drills between Russia and China, they're aimed at the common threats seen by these two countries, but also, they say, maintaining international and regional peace and stability. What is China and Russia's definition of this? Is it the same as, say, Taiwan's or the US's?
I think the Russia-China military cooperation, especially in the Indo-Pacific, started to get accelerated, especially after year 2020 and 21. We saw more and more the Chinese and the Russian geomilitary operation and drills. First in Japan Sea, and then all the way down to the EC. And the recent exercise just 300 kilometers away from Taipei. So it's very near to Taiwan, but also very near to the Okinawa. So I think those exercises, especially if we go back to the past history in year 2015, despite the already several years of existence of exercises, but actually it's getting more and more pointedly strategic for the strategic location as well as political message. In year 2015, that exercises was at the South China Sea. So to a certain extent to support the Chinese positions, knowing that year 2016, the
International Tribunal ruled
that the result will come
China.
out. And then in 1819, especially from the 1920s, the geomilitary drill between the China and Russia, they are aiming at the area that is adjacent to Japan. So the political or strategic pressure on Japan, that's very apparent. But right now, this location at the EC, near Okinawa and very near to Taiwan, there's also another political message regarding how the U.S. support for Taiwan and how the China-Russia's position about this. So we are seeing more and more evidence about the China-Russia, the no-limit cooperations, the kind of alliances. China is in support of Russia's position about how the NATO is causing Russia to react. And Russia is supporting Chinese opposition to the Indo-Pacific strategy.
Do you think that that Russia would act with China in any Taiwan contingency?
In the past, I think all the strategic planners and defense planners in Taiwan, they would not take Russia into account about the contingency on Taiwan by Chinese attack. But right now, as we saw, there are more and more the developments regarding China-Russia relations. Russia might play a role. The role probably not military, but politically as well as economically. And politically, not only support of the Chinese positions, but Russia could also, in the United Nations, by claiming with the same position with China that Taiwan is actually a part of China, and started to blame the countries like United States or Japan should China attack Taiwan, as those countries they are interfering in Chinese domestic affairs, and make it very difficult for them politically should they wanted to help Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. Still to come in the show, how the recruitment by China of former pilots trained on US defense platforms could impact Taiwan.
Having former military personnel going to go work with the People's Liberation Army is very dangerous in the long term, and could provide a better insight into how the United States and some of its allies could respond to a contingency related to Taiwan militarily.
But first, Australia's relationship with China gained a new footing with a visit by Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong to Beijing. Canberra has said it wants the lifting of trade sanctions and consular access to two Australians, journalists Chen Lei and writer Yang Hengjun. Both are detained and waiting sentences after closed-door national security trials. But will the Chinese Communist Party expect support for its application to a massive trading bloc in exchange?
I've previously said in relation to the CPTPP, our focus is on the current UK accession and any economy that sought to join the CPTPP would need to ensure that all parties to the agreement are confident that it could meet its very high standard.
That was Penny Wong, Australia's Foreign Minister, speaking in Beijing. President Lai, what sort of pressure do you think will there be on Australia to be open to China's application to the CPTPP?
I have to say that just as Penny Wong, Australian Foreign Minister, just said earlier, that CPTPP needs all parties to be as comfortable as allowing any other new members. And apparently, not everyone in the CPTPP club, they are comfortable as the Chinese applications due to the kind of the agreement or the requirement for China to abide by the CPTPP rule. But going back to the Australia and China relationship, the China, especially in year 2020, they studied the economic sanctions against Australia due to Australia's earlier government demand for the investigations regarding the origin of the COVID-19. And China believed that this is the direct investigation against them, so they placed all the sanctions, lobsters and wines and all that on Australia, and it continues today. Irrespective of the existence of the Australia-China, the FTA through the RCEP. So that when we talk about the kind of the issues, Australia-China economic relationship, they already had several mechanisms for facilitating the trade. But despite the existence of those, China can still politically would like to do anything, and with political reasons. So that for Australia, the China economic relation, if that is the driver for the Australia-China political relations, I would say that in the last 2 or 3 years, that foundation has been very much damaged. The Australia right now, looking at China, first through the Quad, about how the Australia and Japan and United States and India, they need to form a common position vis-a-vis China. But at the same time, that there are the bilateral issues that Australia need to deal with China, just like the two hostages, in my view, that Penny Wong would like to talk with the Wang Yi. And finally, I would say that the kind of economic issues that Australia, irrespective of the sanction by China on Australia, some of the natural resources and China still need Australia, so that China choose not to have sanction on those. So when people talk about how Australia is needing China, but I would say that in the last 2 or 3 years about the Chinese action itself, many of those needs make Australia less vulnerable to China.
Professor Tso, ahead of entry into the CPTPP, there's a requirement that there are no trade disputes. So there is a trade dispute between Australia and China. Do you think there will be pressure on Australia to drop that case in the WTO as part of, the warming of ties, and Canberra wants to get consular access to the two detained?
No, I think I see it in the opposite direction. I think there's a pressure on China to solve the problem before it can be admitted into the CPTPP. And actually, Australia has made it a precondition for China's entry into CPTPP. And recently, I saw that after Penny Wong's visit to Beijing, the two sides have agreed to have talks between trade ministers of both sides. I think that's a positive sign of both sides. That's a positive sign for the trade dispute to be resolved. Previously, the Chinese trade minister has declined to meet his Australian counterpart. And the trade dispute has been there for a long time without finding satisfactory ways to get it resolved.
Do you think that Beijing will want something in return for the two things that we've identified Canberra wants? Essentially, they want the release of the two Australian citizens, don't they? And they want the lifting of the trade bans. What will Beijing ask for in return?
as we see in other cases, such as the two Michaels in Canada or the Brittany Griner in the United States, the release of prisoners is usually secured when there's a chance for prisoner exchange. But right now, I do not see that chance for for Chen Lai and for Yang Hanjun. So I think the best chance for China to release them may have several reasons. One is to show goodwill and to make an image boost for China. And the other reason is that these two persons have been detained in China for more than 3 years. And so it is now there's hope that when time is ripe, they may be released for them to return home. And also another good sign for this is that the treatment for them is improving. For example, Chen Lai is now allowed to write letters to her partner, and also Yang Hanjun is now allowed to receive books. So I think even though this is a very tiny thing, but that is an indication that their treatment, the treatment received is improving, and also their health condition is improving. That's what I understand from the news report.
Okay, let me bring in President Lai. Let's move on to the very final question, which is about Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. His appointment as the ambassador, Australian ambassador to the United States, what message does this send, do you think, to Beijing?
Kevin Rudd usually is the person who claimed that he knows China the best, and of course he speaks very fluent Chinese, and he knows the leadership in Beijing. But I would say the leadership, basically, that is the leadership during the Hu Jintao era. He's
been quite critical, though, recently, has he not?
To the Xi Jinping. And by having Kevin Rudd to be an ambassador to the United States, to a certain extent, it seems to indicate that to the U.S. about Australia and U.S., one of the main things is about the position on China. So they sent Kevin Rudd, and also Kevin Rudd was a former prime minister. So it's a very, very prestigious and higher positions than anyone that you can have. But of course, within Australia, the political right wing who have a very different opinion regarding Kevin Rudd tended to interpret this in a very different way. But I would say that the Kevin Rudd is having had a good term with the Democratic government in the past of the United States, so that having him there probably will secure a better relationship between Australia and the United States, especially in the Biden administration.
Okay. And finally, the United States government has requested the extradition from Australia of a former US Marine pilot, Daniel Duggan. Duggan is accused of breaking US arms control law by training Chinese military pilots to land on aircraft carriers. Duggan has denied breaking any law. For our extended interview today, Bryce Barros, the China Affairs analyst at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, speaks to me about why China's military is recruiting former pilots. Let's take a look. The PLA is recruiting former pilots across UK, US, Australia, and even France. Why are they doing this?
So I think the People's Liberation Army is trying to recruit pilots formerly from the militaries of the United Kingdom, France, United States, and Australia, because they think that they can learn the techniques, tactics, and procedures that their air forces use, or navies and armies in some cases, use whenever it might come into a potential conflict with one of those countries in some ways, or at least to improve their own training.
What are the governments doing to try to stop this trend?
I think it's important for the United States to encourage dialogue and make sure that their ally partners, treaty ally partners, like the three other countries we mentioned, are doing more to ensure legislatively that this sort of involvement of former military personnel in the defense complex or military complex of countries like China is illegal, and that this would be tied to things like retirement, pension, facing jail time, other sort of means of being able to deter former personnel from wanting to engage in working with a military like the People's Liberation Army, not only because it's not in their best interests, but it's also not in the national security interests of these respective countries.
You said it's not in the interests of the pilots themselves, but obviously they think it is. I mean, the salaries are highly lucrative.
I think it speaks to potentially some of the lack of opportunities that some of these individuals might feel once they get out of their service. I also think it speaks to a lack of clearness in making it very known that this kind of work, given the sort of competition that the United States has with the People's Liberation Army and China broadly, that this is not welcome. And I think that also the governments of these different countries could potentially do things to encourage them to not want to work for future adversaries, like maybe setting up talent pipeline programs with, not that there aren't already pipelines for former military pilots to go into commercial service and other things, but I do think it's worth exploring more opportunities to work with private industry so that there's more opportunities provided to former military personnel so that they don't feel like they need to go to a place like China and work with the People's Liberation Army to help increase their own defense and military readiness.
Is this a phenomenon that's quite new, or has it been going on for a while?
I can't speak to whether or not this is something that's been going on for a while. I mean, there are historic cases of former military personnel helping across centuries, helping new sort of emerging military powers build up their own defenses. I think the Meiji Restoration and the arms building of Imperial Japan is a very good example of that, because we're sharing a lot of the same defense platforms, weapon systems, aircraft, and whatnot. Having former military personnel from a NATO country or from another U.S. treaty ally going to go work with the People's Liberation Army is very dangerous in the long term, and could provide a better insight into how the United States and some of its allies could respond to a contingency related to Taiwan militarily.
I was interested in finding out about the French pilots. The report said that they were of particular interest to the PLA because of the pilots that fly off aircraft carriers. Can you talk about any sort of very specific skills or experience that the PLA is looking for at this moment?
So I think I can't speak to any of the specific skills or experiences that the PLA is looking for, other than what you just mentioned. I think the desire to want to gain better understandings, or rather more experience working on platforms like aircraft carriers, makes sense. I also think in the case of France, obviously, as many in Taiwan know, Taiwan still uses the Mirage 2000s. There's also a little bit of a desire to want to understand how those platforms work, in addition to Taiwanese military personnel having had the opportunity to train on those platforms in France, which has been known in Taiwan for a long time. I think that's a big element of it. But I think there's also a desire to want to understand how to have more combat readiness. You also have to remember the People's Liberation Army currently does not have any veterans in it. And because of that, there's also a desire in many People's Liberation Army related writings to want to figure out how can we gain more experience. And I think one of those ways that can be substituted, or rather the People's Liberation Army is attempting to substitute that, is by gaining insight from former pilots from the United States and some of the allies we just mentioned, like France.
Do you see any parallels with the US's chip export controls on China? So technology and military.
I think there's a little bit of a parallel there in terms of trying to stop US citizens from assisting those efforts, to similarly what we found with some of these pilots with the People's Liberation Army. And I do think that is kind of a good analogy, and maybe even potentially a good model for something that, Congress could make more explicit. Any sort of US citizen or national that's viewed as trying to actively support the Chinese military in some way, that is not good and could be met with, jail time or something along those lines.
Could there be legislation that extends to, any former pilots that had worked on American weapons or military systems?
Yes, I do think that there can be, and I think a really good example would be anyone involved in the F-35 project, given how multinational that's been, and the focus on U.S. allies and partners through that project. I think that's just one good example. There's many, many other defense platforms where the United States has trained many other former personnel across the world, ally and partner alike, where that would be very sensitive. And I do think that there could be more stringent restrictions put on those individuals as well.
So in the UK, we understand through the media reports that there were up to 30 pilots. That seems to be the largest number from any country, at least reported. Does that reflect at all on the UK?
I don't know if I could say that that necessarily reflects on the UK as a whole. I do think that it means that the United States should continue to have further conversations with UK defense officials. And I do think with the new prime minister who came in, Rishi Sunak, and there's more of a desire to want to continue pushing on issues of mutual concern through the special relationship, that the Biden administration is really well positioned. And also in the UK, there's been like an evolution within the last few years to recognize that China's more of a threat. I think that there are many individuals in the UK who work in the policy space who would be very willing to work with the United States on this issue. But I think it comes down to whether or not the US is able to convey the seriousness of it, and whether or not policymakers in the UK continue to view China as being a threat to them as well. And I think that conversation has really evolved in a way that I don't think it would have been maybe 5-6 years ago.